The moment Maris Wren climbed into that creaking stagecoach, bound for Wyoming, the other women might as well have nailed her coffin shut with their stares. Petticoats rustled like rattlesnake warnings as they clutched their shawls tighter, their needlework frozen mid-stitch. Martha Caldwell, a preacher's wife, with a face like sourdough even accidentally, elbowed Maris's modest trunk into the dirt when they stopped to water the horses. "Ain't no use for porcelain dolls out here," one of them muttered loud enough for the whole coach to hear. What they didn't see were the scars beneath Maris's lace gloves, burn marks from endless nights, boiling rags for her grandmother's tuberculosis, fingers crooked from scrubbing pharmacy floors to pay for the morphine that barely eased the old woman's pain. Back in Pittsburgh, she'd buried Elodie Wren in a pauper's grave. As snow fell like ashes, the factory whistles, drowning out her prayers. That's when the letters from rancher Thomas Briggs started arriving, each one smelling of saddle leather and desperation. His third letter contained a railroad ticket and a single line: "Wyoming don't care about your past. Just bring your backbone." But the frontier had its own ideas. At the Cheyenne way station, a whiskey-drinking wrangler took one look at Maris's unblemished bonnet and drawled, "That one'll last till the first blizzard if the wolves don't get her." The women tittered, but Maris surprised them all by grabbing the man's own revolver from his holster and spinning the cylinder like she'd done it 100 times. "My grandmother shot revenuers during the war," she lied smoothly, the metal cool against her palm. "Taught me to aim for the eyes." The coach fell so quiet you could hear the wind howling through the bullet holes in the station walls. By the time they reached the Powder River crossing, even Martha Caldwell was stealing glances at Maris's journal, filled not with pressed flowers like they'd assumed, but with sketches of irrigation systems and calculations for crop rotations. Turns out, Elodie hadn't just raised a grieving granddaughter. She'd raised a woman who'd memorized every agricultural almanac in the Carnegie Library between fever spells. When the axle broke near Laramie, it was Maris who rigged a fix, using corset wire and a hairpin, her hands moving with the same precision they'd used to measure out her grandmother's last doses of laudanum. As the sun dipped below the Tetons, one of the younger brides finally dared to ask, "Why'd you really come out here?" Maris watched the horizon bleed crimson and thought of Thomas's last letter. "Out here, the land don't forgive, but it also don't pretend." She smiled for the first time in 300 miles. "Same reason as you, sugar, to stop being what everyone expected." The wind carried away Martha's gasp as the wolves began to howl. The Briggs Ranch didn't just have rules, it had an entire unwritten constitution, and Viola Briggs, no one dared call her Vida. To her face was its iron-fisted Chief Justice. That first supper, Maris learned the true meaning of silence. The clink of silverware against china might as well have been gunshots in that tomb of a dining room. Viola's gaze lingered on Maris's hands, too rough for a lady, yet too delicate for a rancher's wife, while Thomas stared at his plate like a man awaiting sentencing. "We rise at 4, Viola announced, not to Maris, but to the pot roast. "Women who sleep past dawn here tend to find their trunks packed by noon." Then came the Great Jam incident. Maris, who'd spent years preserving every berry and root her grandmother could scavenge, made the fatal error of rearranging Viola's pantry. "Strawberry belongs next to blackberry." She'd murmured more to herself than anyone, but Viola materialized like a specter, her knuckles whitening around a jar of peach preserves. "This isn't some Philadelphia tea room," she hissed. "We don't alphabetize survival." The jar shattered against the hearth in a sticky explosion glass, glittering like the ice in Viola's eyes. That night, Thomas finally spoke, not in their bed-separate rooms, per his mother's decree, but through the locked door, his voice muffled by oak. She broke Pa's favorite whiskey glass the day he died. Still sweeps up slivers every Sunday. The turning point came when a blizzard trapped them for 3 days. Viola, feverish from chopping wood in wet boots, lay shivering under quilts, while Morris brewed a pine needle poultice, the same one that had eased Elodie's coughs. "You'll kill her with that backwoods poison," Thomas muttered. But Morris pressed the steaming cloth to Viola's chest with the same stubbornness that had carried her across half a continent. The old woman's breath hitched not from pain but recognition. You smell like camphor and lye soap," Viola rasped, "just like my sister did during the cholera winter." By dawn, the fever broke. Viola didn't thank her. Instead, she wordlessly slid a rusted key across the kitchen table, the one to Thomas's childhood room, where his letters had been hidden in a hollowed-out Bible. The pages smelled of tobacco and hesitation, each crossed-out word proof that the real Thomas Briggs still existed beneath his mother's shadow. Outside, the thawing snow dripped from the eaves like a ticking clock. Maris pocketed the key and stepped onto the porch, where Thomas stood gripping the railing like it was the edge of a cliff. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. She smirked, shaking snow from her hair. "Sugar, you ain't seen nothing yet." Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Or maybe it was just Viola finally learning to laugh. The quilting circle ladies never saw it coming. One minute, they were clucking like hens over Reverend Pike's new wife. "That girl sews a straight seam, but her pie crusts could double as roofing shingles." The next, Maris was calmly stitching a perfect flying geese pattern backward, without a template. Needle flashing like a dueling pistol, she didn't even look up when Viola's prized tabby cat knocked over the elderberry wine. "My grandmother taught me this during the year she went blind," Maris said casually, watching Mrs. Henderson's thimble freeze midair. "Said if I could quilt by touch, I'd never be helpless." The room got so quiet, they could hear the cat licking wine off its paws. Back at the ranch, Rowdy Briggs started calling her Doc, partly because she'd saved a colicky mare with a whiskey and molasses drench. Take that, Philadelphia finishing schools, but mostly because she diagnosed his dementia before the town physician had. One twilight, she found him by the corral, trying to rope a post, like it was 1875. "You're late for supper, Mr. Briggs," she said, offering her arm. He squinted at her sweat staining his shirt. "Martha, that you are, Martha, his long-dead sister." Morris adjusted her grip. Close enough. They walked slow, as molasses toward the house, his gnarled hand trembling on her sleeve. Halfway there, he suddenly stopped, lucid as sunrise. "You're stealing my boy's heart, same way you stole my good whiskey." Morris nearly choked. "Sir, I don't." "The hell you don't," he cackled, patting her pocket, where she'd hidden the key to Thomas's letters. "Just don't tell Viola. Woman's got a temper like a stepped-on rattler." Then came the Sunday Viola decided to test her. Church picnic, everyone dressed in their stiffest linens. Maris arrived late, not from vanity, but because she'd been helping birth a breech calf, her sleeves still damp with afterbirth. Viola thrust a pie at her. "The Larsons always bring dessert. Translation: impress them or disappear." Maris stared at the sad, sagging crust. Somewhere behind her, Thomas held his breath. With a shrug, she flipped the pie upside down, onto a plate, the caramelized apples now gloriously on top. "There," she declared, dusting sugar over the wreckage like fairy dust. "Now, it's a tarte tatin." French. The Larson twins gasped, like she'd performed alchemy. Viola's left eye twitched. Thomas bit his lip so hard he tasted blood. That night, He accidentally left his bedroom door ajar. Through the crack, Maris saw him rereading her letters, not by candlelight, but by the full moon, streaming through the window. One finger traced the ink, where she described Pittsburgh's smokestacks at dawn. They say the soot gets in your lungs, but Grandma swore it put iron in your blood. Outside, a coyote yipped. Somewhere between that sound and the creak of floorboards, Thomas Briggs finally understood. This woman didn't just survive storms. She became them. Maris's fingers tightened around the stem of her water goblet, the only piece of crystal she'd been trusted with, as every eye in the room pinned her like a butterfly to corkboard. Across the table, Thomas's knuckles whitened around his steak knife. Even Rowdy lost in his fog. Most days blinked into sudden clarity. Then the miracle happened. Widow Crawford's Pomeranian, hitherto silent under the table, let out a yelp and launched itself at Viola's ankle. The old woman jerked back, spilling claret across the linen like a bloodstain. In the chaos, Maris rose, with the grace of a woman who dodged worse than social ambushes. She didn't reach for the ruined tablecloth. Instead, she lifted the entire silver dessert tray, flawless peach cobbler, now swimming in wine, and carried it to the sideboard with the solemnity of a priest holding communion. "What do I bring to this table, Mrs. Briggs?" Maris's voice cut through the murmurs like a Bowie knife. She held up one finger, then disappeared into the kitchen. The guests exchanged glances. Henderson the banker smirked into his napkin. Thomas half rose from his seat, until Maris returned carrying a cast-iron skillet, still smoking from the stove. She dropped it onto the table, with a thud that made the china jump. Inside sizzled 6 perfect steaks, seared in whiskey and rosemary, besides the ability to salvage a $40 cut of prime beef in 3 minutes flat. Maris plucked a fork from the stunned widow's place setting and flipped a steak with theatrical flair. "I bring the recipe for curing your apple blight. The coordinates to that lost aquifer your foreman's been hunting since spring." And she tossed Thomas a look that could have ignited wet kindling. "The fact that your son hasn't slept through the night in 2 years, but did last Thursday after I slipped valerian root into his coffee." Silence. Then glory of glories. Rowdy Briggs let out a wheezing laugh that turned into a coughing fit. "Damn if she ain't got you there, Vi," he gasped, pounding the table hard enough to rattle the silver. Viola's face cycled through shades of puce. Thomas stared at Maris like she'd just lassoed the moon. And young Billy Hutchinson, who'd been doodling cattle brands on his napkin, whispered loud enough to carry "Ma, can we hire her?" Maris didn't wait for applause. She untied her lace-trimmed apron, Viola's idea of proper attire, and draped it over the empty chair. The silk dress could choke her. The pins in her hair could stab. But out here in the West, under all these layers, she was still the woman who'd survived factory fires and consumption wards. As she turned toward the kitchen, Thomas's hand caught her wrist. His palm was calloused, warm, and trembling slightly. "The aquifer coordinates," he said too low for others to hear. "Were you bluffing?" She leaned down her breath, stirring the hair at his temple. "Sugar, I memorized your entire ranch ledger while you were snoring." Then louder for the room. "Now, if you'll excuse me, someone's got to rescue dessert." Behind her, the grandfather clock struck the hour. Somewhere between the chimes, Viola Briggs's wine glass cracked clean down the middle. The breaking point came on a Tuesday because of course it did. Tuesdays were for washing linens, and Maris was elbow-deep in scalding water when Viola accidentally knocked the soap into the fire. "Oh dear," the old woman murmured, watching the lye crackle in the flames. "However will you manage?" Maris didn't blink. She wrung out Holland's shirt, with hands already raw from scrubbing, and tossed it dripping over Viola's favorite porcelain shepherdess. Like that, 2 hours later, She found Thomas in the barn, mending a bridle with more violence than skill. "Your mother wants me gone," she said, leaning against the stall door. The bay mare inside lipped at her sleeve like an old friend. Thomas's hands stilled. "I know. And you?" The question hung between them, sharp as a hayfork. He looked up, then his eyes the same storm gray as the clouds rolling in over the Tetons. "I want the woman who told my mother to go to hell in front of the territorial banker." A beat, then quieter. "I want the woman who hummed Barbara Allen to my father while he cried for a sister dead 40 years. Maris exhaled through her nose. The mare nuzzled her pocket for sugar she didn't have. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. That's when the shot rang out. They reached the north pasture to find Rowdy standing over a dead coyote. Holland's colt, smoking in his shaking hands. "Damn thing was after the lambs," he panted, then blinked at Maris with startling clarity. "Martha, you're supposed to be in Denver." Maris took the gun gently. "It's me, Mr. Briggs." "Maris." The old man's face crumpled. "Christ alive, girl, why are you still here?" He gestured wildly at the house, where Viola stood, silhouetted in the window. "This family's got more skeletons than a Boot Hill cemetery. That one, oh," he jabbed a finger toward Thomas, "still writes letters to his dead wife every damn Christmas." Thunder rumbled. Thomas looked like he'd been gut-shot. Rowdy wasn't finished. He grabbed Maris's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "You got spine enough for 10 men, but even spines break." He pressed something into her palm, a rusted railroad token, dated 1879. "Next supply train's Thursday. Denver or Glory, girl. Choose smart." The rain came down in sheets as Maris unfolded her fingers. The token read, "One way." Behind them, Thomas made a sound like a wounded animal. "Is that what you want?" Maris closed her fist around the metal. It bit into her flesh like a promise. "What I want," she said slowly, "is to stop being the only one fighting for this." Lightning split the sky. Somewhere in the house, a window slammed shut. Thomas took one step forward, then another. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough as unplaned wood. "Then fight me instead of her. Just stay." The token dropped into the mud between them. Maris looked down at it, then up at the man who'd written her letters about infinity and cattle prices. The man who'd watched her walk through fire and never once reached for water. She wiped her hands on her apron, the same one she'd flung on that dinner table battlefield, and said the 4 words that would change everything. "Prove it. Burn the letters." Viola's scream from the porch was almost comical. Thomas didn't even flinch. He just kept staring at Maris, like she held the deed to his soul. The storm raged on. Somewhere a train whistle blew. The storm raged like God himself was angry, but Viola Briggs had fury enough for both of them. She cornered Thomas by the fireplace, her shawl flapping like bat wings in the draft. "That woman," she hissed, jerking her chin toward the kitchen, where Maris was securing the pantry, "brought this down on us, just like she did at the dinner." A deafening crack cut her off as lightning struck the old cottonwood by the creek. The house plunged into darkness, save for the erratic glow of the fire. In the sudden blackness, Rowdy's voice boomed from the hallway. "Vi, if the Lord's smiting us, it's more likely for your mouth than Maris's bread." Thomas didn't laugh. He was too busy watching Maris emerge from the kitchen, a hurricane lamp in one hand and his old hunting rifle in the other. The golden light carved shadows under her cheekbones, making her look like some frontier-avenging angel. "Barn roof's gone," she said matter-of-factly, handing him the gun. "Your prize bull's loose near the north gully." Viola made a sound like a tea kettle boiling over. "You expect him to go out in Thomas was already shrugging into his oilskin. Morris wordlessly tossed him his spare gloves, the ones she'd mended last week, stitches neat as piano keys. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and something unspoken passed between them louder than the storm. Then came the scream. Not human, not animal. Something in between the sound of wood splitting and a woman's terror tangled together. They reached the back porch, just in time to see the chicken coop collapse, its beams snapping like kindling under the wind's assault. But what froze Thomas's blood was the small figure trapped beneath the wreckage, young Billy Hutchinson, who'd been sheltering there after delivering eggs. Morris moved before anyone could blink. She hit the muddy yard at a dead-run nightgown plastered to her legs by the rain. By the time Thomas caught up, she was on her knees beside the boy, her hands already working to lift the beam pinning his leg. "Alive!" she shouted over the wind, but the splinter went clean through his boot. Viola appeared at Thomas's elbow, her face ashen. "That's Henderson's nephew. If he dies here..." Morris didn't look up. She just yanked the pearl-handled knife from Viola's own apron pocket and slit the boy's boot open with one practiced motion. "Your vinegar," she demanded, holding out a blood-smeared hand to Viola. "Now, unless you prefer gangrene with your gossip." The storm howled. Viola hesitated exactly 3 heartbeats, then turned and ran for the house, like the devil was at her heels. Thomas dropped to his knees beside Morris in the mud. Up close, he could see her shaking not from fear, but from the effort of holding the beam aloft. Blood and rainwater streaked her face like war paint. "You're gonna owe me new stitching needles after this," she muttered, baring her teeth in something too wild to be a smile. Lightning flashed. In that stark white instant, Thomas saw everything he'd been too stubborn to name. This fierce, flower-dusted woman, who'd walked into his life with calloused hands and a railroad token in her pocket, was the only home he'd ever wanted. He gripped the beam beside her, their shoulders pressed together in the downpour. "Morris Wren," he said, voice raw as the wind. "If we live through this, I'm burning every damn letter." Somewhere behind them, Viola returned with the vinegar. And for the first time in 30 years, she handed something to another woman, without a single word of complaint. The storm raged on. But in that moment, something quiet and unbreakable took root between them, deeper than duty, stronger than pride. The kind of thing that could build a life on. The morning sun revealed more than just storm damage. It exposed the truth in broad daylight. Morris knelt in the sawdust, running her fingers along a warped barn board. "This one's still good," she murmured, more to herself than to Thomas. But he heard. He always heard her now. Viola chose that moment to make her grand entrance, her black mourning dress swapped for stiff calico, as if changing clothes could erase last night's surrender. She carried a tray with 2 steaming mugs, the china clinking like a death knell. "Coffee," she announced, as if bestowing some royal favor. Morris didn't look up. "We'll need nails. The big ones from the cellar." A muscle twitched in Viola's jaw. For a breathless moment, the old battle lines trembled, until Thomas reached for a mug and said, casual as Sunday, "Mother, fetch the ledger from my office too. We're adding a proper library to the West Wing." The tray rattled. Viola's eyes darted between them, finally landing on the half-built bookshelf, taking shape in the corner. Not just functional pine, but cherrywood, Thomas's wedding gift to his first wife, left to gather dust for years. Morris stood wiping sawdust from her trousers. Viola's gasp was almost worth the scandal. She took the other mug and sipped, never breaking eye contact with the older woman. 3 sugars. Just how I like it." The victory was small, but seismic. By noon, the whole ranch felt the shift. The hands stopped tiptoeing around Morris, bringing their mending and questions directly to her instead of Viola's parlor. Rowdy held court on the porch, cackling, as he supervised, while whittling what suspiciously resembled his sister-in-law's nose. But the real revelation came at supper. Morris set the table with Elodie's cracked china, the pieces she'd salvaged from Pittsburgh, wrapped in newspaper at the bottom of her trunk. Viola opened her mouth, doubtless to comment on the impropriety, when Thomas dropped his bombshell. "We're hosting the spring cattle auction." Viola's fork clattered. "The women's auction. The main auction," Thomas corrected, reaching for Morris's hand right there on the tablecloth. "Morris will handle the books and the negotiations." Now, it was Morris's turn to stare. The cattle auction was Briggs Ranch's crown jewel. Viola had personally overseen it for 20 years. The older woman's face purpled. "You'd let some factory girl—" "Careful, Mother." Thomas's thumb traced Morris's ink-stained knuckles. "That factory girl out-negotiated Henderson's lawyers on the water rights last week, while baking 4 dozen sourdough rolls." A beat of silence. Then, "Actually," Morris said sweetly, "it was 6 dozen. Rowdy's guffaw shook the rafters. Even the ranch dogs perked up at the sound. Viola stood so fast, her chair toppled, but no one moved to right it. Least of all Thomas, who was too busy staring at his wife, like she'd hung the moon, instead of just exposing his mother's tyranny. As Viola stormed out, Morris leaned close, her whisper tickling his ear. "You know, she's going to burn my rose bushes tonight." Thomas finally smiled, a real unguarded grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Worth it?" Outside the first spring, peepers began to sing. The sound carried farther than any storm. The table became their silent rebellion. Every morning Morris would trace the knot in the wood, where Thomas's plane had slipped a flaw that made it theirs. Viola took to calling it that splintered monstrosity, but even she couldn't deny its usefulness when the church ladies came calling, and Morris served her infamous whiskey-spiked apple pie right on the bare wood. Then came the incident of the hidden drawer. One blustery January night, Thomas caught Morris kneeling beside their creation, a chisel in one hand and his childhood jackknife in the other. Planning to improve on perfection, he teased, shaking snow from his coat. She didn't smile. Improve on privacy. With a twist of the knife, a hidden compartment sprang open beneath the tabletop, just large enough for a woman's letters, a railroad token, and a small velvet pouch that clinked when moved. Thomas froze. The pouch held his father's gold pocket watch, the one Viola claimed was lost after the funeral. Morris met his gaze without flinching. "Rowdy told me where to look." Under the loose floorboard in her bedroom, the fire popped. Somewhere upstairs a door creaked Viola's nightly prowl. Thomas stared at the watch, its chain coiled like a serpent in the drawer. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a deep rolling chuckle that made the dogs bark outside. "Well, I'll be damned," he wheezed, wiping his eyes. "All these years I thought Pa gambled it away." Morris snapped the compartment shut. "Now, you know where the apple didn't fall far from the tree." Their laughter tangled together in the frosty acres, thus warmer than the hearth. That night, for the first time, Thomas moved his shaving kit from the separate bedroom to Morris's dresser. Viola didn't comment, but next morning they found her prized rose-patterned teacup, the one she'd never let anyone use, placed pointedly on their rough-hewn table, steam curling from its surface like a white flag. Spring came early that year. On the morning of the cattle auction, Morris stood at their table reviewing ledgers when Thomas slid a folded paper across the wood. "The deed to the west, 40 acres in her name only. Insurance," he said quietly. "In case you ever need to remember, this is your table too." Outside, wagon wheels crunched on gravel as buyers arrived. Viola's voice carried from the porch as she directed hands with uncharacteristic cheer. Morris folded the deed, carefully tucked it into her hidden drawer, and kissed her husband full on the mouth, right as the Henderson party walked in. The banker's wife gasped. One of the ranch hands whistled. Thomas turned the color of new barn paint. Maris just smoothed her skirts and picked up the ledger. "Gentlemen," she said sweetly, "let's talk numbers." And oh, how the numbers sang. By sundown, Briggs Ranch had secured deals that would make them the wealthiest spread in the territory. Viola poured lemonade for everyone. Her smile strained but present. Rowdy held court on the porch, telling wildly exaggerated tales of Maris's exploits to anyone who'd listen. And Thomas stood by their imperfect table, watching his wife out-negotiate cattle barons twice her age, and realized he'd never tasted anything sweeter than this victory they'd built together. One hammer stroke, one hidden drawer, one defiant kiss at a time. The Wyoming wind carried the sound of laughter all the way to Pennsylvania that night. Somewhere beneath the stars, Elodie Wren's ghost finally stopped worrying about her granddaughter.